The wind howled like hungry wolves over the snow-capped peaks of Midgard, a chilling breath that seemed to carry the laments of ancestors and the omen of dark times. In the icy depths of a fjord that wound like a scar in the earth stood the fortress of Jotunheim, not a castle of stone and mortar, but a monument raised from the bones of fallen giants, a macabre testament to the power and ambition that shaped the souls of the Norse people. Upon this unholy throne, shrouded in a silence as profound as the abysses of Niflheim, rested the crown of the dead, a diadem forged in despair and adorned with the souls of those who dared defy its wearer. At the heart of this land of ice and steel, where survival was a daily battle against nature and the gods, lived a man whose name was whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence: Bjorn the Guardian. He was not a king by blood right, nor a conqueror thirsting for glory, but one chosen by destiny, a burden he bore with the grim resignation of one who knows the weight of eternity. His eyes, blue as the ice of an ancient glacier, seemed to have witnessed eons of conflict, the wrinkles around them etched by the storms of life, and the taciturn wisdom gained at the cost of immense sacrifice. Bjorn's saga was not merely the story of a Viking warrior. It was the chronicle of a soul forged in the furnace of adversity, a man caught between loyalty to his people and the insidious whispers of a power that promised order at the cost of the very essence of life. The throne of bones and the crown of the dead were more than symbols of authority. They were the physical manifestation of a curse, a cycle of violence and despair that seemed inexhaustible. There was a delicate balance, a tenuous thread that Bjorn strove to maintain. But the world around him teemed with the seeds of discord. From distant kingdoms, dark ambitions began to stir, and the latent power emanating from the throne began to attract the unwanted attention of beings who dwelt in the shadows, those who coveted the cold, ruthless strength the crown promised. The question hanging in the frigid air was whether Bjorn would be able to defend his people and the legacy entrusted to him, or whether he would succumb to the temptation of absolute power, becoming a tyrant forgotten by the ages. The northern lands, once peaceful under Odin's watchful eye and Thor's blessing, were beginning to be haunted by presences that defied human comprehension. Rumors of creatures emerging from hidden caves, with icy skins and eyes that glowed with a hellish red light, spread like wildfire through the coastal villages. These were not the usual foes Bjorn's warriors expected to encounter on raids or defenses. They were ancient horrors, echoes of a time when giants and monsters roamed freely, before the gods established the precarious order that sustained existence. The land itself seemed to react to this cosmic upheaval. The seas, usually imposing in their fury, became treacherous, with waves that seemed to have a life of their own, swallowing ships with a voracity that transcended the natural force of the tides. The aurora borealis, once seen as Freya's celestial dances, now took on dark, menacing hues, snaking across the night sky like the tentacles of a maddened cosmic being. Nature, in its primordial wisdom, was sending signals, and Bjorn, with his intrinsic connection to the land and the spirits that inhabited it, felt this disturbance in his bones. He was the Guardian, and this title was not just a nickname, but a non-negotiable destiny. The throne of bones, built with the sacrifice and strength of countless lives, was the epicenter of this growing anomaly, and the crown of the dead that rested upon it pulsed with a cold, ancient energy, calling to itself those who sought to master the fine line between life and death. Bjorn's dilemma was profound. He was the protector, yes, but the power he swore to defend was a double-edged sword. The temptation to use the full force of the crown to annihilate these new threats was immense. A seductive voice whispering in the silence of his soul, promising peace and security through total submission. Yet he knew, with the bitter clarity of experience, that such a path led to darkness, self-forgetfulness, and the loss of all he had sworn to protect. Free will, that divine gift so prized by mankind, became, in his situation, a spiritual battlefield. Bjorn stood on the balcony of his bone fortress, his bearskin cloak heavy on his broad shoulders, a shield against the relentless wind that lashed the macabre walls. Below him, the flickering lights of a distant Viking village twinkled in the darkness, a poignant reminder of the people he had sworn to protect. He was not a man of many words, but his presence exuded an innate authority, an aura of restrained power that silenced even the bravest warriors in his presence. His beard, woven with silver threads that reflected the pale moonlight, framed a face scarred by battle, and the melancholy of one who carries the weight of the world on his shoulders. His eyes, a deep, piercing blue, reflected not only the fire of battle, but also the dark wisdom of one who has glimpsed the veils of reality and the implacable fate of mortals. Bjorn was the guardian of the Bone Throne and the crown of the dead. The throne was no ordinary seat of power. It was a grim monument erected from the remains of ancient giants, a constant reminder of the fragility of existence and the raw power that lay dormant beneath the earth's skin. The crown, meanwhile, was an artifact of unimaginable power, forged from the essence of lost souls and adorned with gems that seemed to contain the radiance of dying stars. Legends held that whoever wore it held the power to command the living and the dead, to influence the course of fate and bend reality to their will. But this power came with a price, an insidious seduction that corrupted the soul, transforming the bearer into a shadow of themselves, a slave to their own ambition. Bjorn had inherited this responsibility not by conquest, but by a fate sealed in blood and sacrifice, a legacy that isolated him from the people he loved. He was the shield between Midgard and the darkness that lurked beyond the veil of reality, a lone guardian against the rising tides of chaos. The threat came not only from human enemies, from neighboring kingdoms coveting Norse power, but from something older, more sinister, nightmarish creatures born from the icy depths and forgotten forests began to emerge, their eyes burning with a primordial hunger. The fjords, once thoroughfares for trade and exploration, now became roots of terror, with ghostly ships sailing waters no mortal vessel would dare cross. Winter, long a natural enemy, now seemed amplified, a reflection of the darkness seeping into the heart of the world. Bjorn's presence was a force of nature in itself. His skill in combat was legendary. He fought with the fury of a charging wolf and the precision of a hawk in flight. With his two-handed axe, Black Ice, he could cleave steel as easily as he chopped wood, and his war cries echoed across the snowy plains, inspiring his men to feats of bravery that defied logic. But his strength lay not only in his martial prowess. Bjorn possessed a deep connection with the spirits of the earth and the sky, a sensitivity that allowed him to sense the changes in the air, anticipate threats, and understand the silent language of nature. This connection, forged over long years of solitude and meditation in the untamed landscapes, was the source of his wisdom and resilience. Yet this same connection was his greatest weakness. The crown of the dead, at its core, was a spiritual parasite, feeding on the life energy of its wearer, distorting their thoughts and emotions. gradually erasing humanity in exchange for power. Bjorn felt this insidious influence daily, a silent battle waged within his own mind. The Crown's whispers promised a swift end to threats, a peace achieved through total annihilation, a shortcut to safety that he knew was a trap. The temptation to embrace this power, to use it to eradicate the darkness once and for all, was a constant burden, a battle against himself as fierce as any physical combat. Honor, the code of conduct that guided his life, became a daily testing ground, a fine line he fought not to cross. He saw in their eyes the reflection of men who had once been great, but who had succumbed to the Crown, becoming cruel and tyrannical monsters. The fear of becoming one of them was his greatest torment. His dilemma was one of choice, of free will in the face of an almost uncontrollable destiny. Could he resist the lure of absolute power? Protect his people without becoming the monster he swore to fight? The answer lay in the trials that lay ahead, in the battles that would decide not only the future of his kingdom, but Bjorn's very soul. Villages burned, raging seas swallowed ships, and creatures of darkness advanced, and at the center of it all stood Bjorn the Guardian, a man against a dark destiny. Night fell over Jotunheim like a black velvet cloak, speckled with cold, distant stars. The fortress, built from the colossal bones of fallen giants, cast ghostly shadows across the desolate landscape. At the center of this somber monument rested the throne of bones, a seat of power as ancient as the mountains. Upon it, the crown of the dead awaited its bearer, a dark silver diadem adorned with black gems that seemed to contain the very essence of night. It was here that Bjorn the Guardian spent most of his days and nights, a lone sentinel against the forces that threatened to engulf his people. His imposing figure, wrapped in a bearskin cloak, was a beacon of hope amidst the gathering darkness. But the weight of the crown, which he occasionally carried on his most critical missions, began to leave deep scars on his soul. The artifact's whispering voice promised absolute power, the ability to subdue his enemies and bring lasting peace to his people. This promise was tantalizing, especially when the hordes of undead and shadowy creatures emerging from the icy depths of Niflheim seemed unstoppable. The reports came in a steady stream of despair. Entire villages annihilated, warriors missing in failed raids, and winter itself becoming a living weapon, with blizzards that seemed to possess the malignant intelligence of a demon. The sea, once a source of sustenance and glory for the Vikings, now became a liquid graveyard, with monstrous waves swallowing ships and throwing their dead remains onto the frozen shores. Bjorn felt the earth beneath his feet tremble with an ancient agony, a portent of impending cataclysm. He knew the balance between good and evil was rapidly deteriorating, and that the crown of the dead, with its forbidden power, might be the only salvation. But each time he felt its power in his hands, a part of his own soul seemed to wither, an echo of the corruption that had consumed so many before him. The dilemma was clear: embrace the dark power to save his people, risking becoming the monster he fought to contain, or resist, trusting in his own strength and the bravery of his warriors, risking total annihilation. This internal struggle, waged in the silence of his icy fortress, was Bjorn's true battle, a war that would decide not only the fate of the Norse kingdoms, but the very definition of heroism in a world teetering on the brink. Legends spoke of a time when gods walked among men, a time of glory and chaos, and Bjorn sensed that time was returning, bringing with it the same promises and the same perils that shaped the fate of men and gods alike. The story of Bjorn the Guardian was the story of a man searching for a path between light and darkness, between duty and temptation, in a world where destiny and free will intertwined in a deadly dance. The plot now delves into the nature of the power Bjorn wields and the consequent disintegration of his own convictions. The Crown of the Dead is not merely an ornament of power. It is a semi-sentient entity, a spiritual siphon that feeds on the life force, the will, and ultimately, the soul of its bearer. Its influence is not a frontal assault, but an insidious erosion, an erosion that manifests as thoughts that become increasingly pragmatic, increasingly cruel. Now, for example, imagine the battle strategy. Previously, Bjorn pondered the honor of the combatants, the risks to his people, with the crown in his possession. This pondering is replaced by a cold, ruthless calculation. What is the quickest and most efficient way to eradicate the threat, regardless of the human or moral cost? He begins to see his own men not as individuals with lives and families, but as mere tools on a cosmic chessboard, disposable pawns in the service of a greater goal, an order that distorts into tyranny. Consider the psychological implications. Empathy, a pillar of leadership and humanity, is the first to be eroded. The enemy's pain becomes irrelevant. The misfortune of a conquered village is reduced to a victory statistic. This progressive dehumanization is the Crown's trump card, for it disarms the bearer of their most powerful defense, the ability to connect with others and feel the weight of their actions. What once motivated Bjorn, protecting the innocent, keeping the flame of life alive amidst the unrelenting cold, is now replaced by a yearning for absolute control, for a definitive end to any and all threats, no matter how insignificant. Furthermore, Bjorn's own perception of reality begins to distort. The lines between what is real and what is an illusion orchestrated by the Crown become increasingly blurred. The whispers he hears, once interpreted as dark counsel, now sound like the undeniable voice of truth, the only wisdom capable of guiding him in times of chaos. He may begin to see threats where none exist, to distrust his most loyal allies, as the Crown incites him to believe that solitude is the only form of true security. Consider a purification ritual he once performed to honor ancestral spirits. Now, under the Crown's influence, that ritual may transform into a macabre sacrifice, an offering of life that the entity deems necessary to reinforce its rule. The souls that adorn the Crown, far from being inert trophies, manifest as fragments of consciousness, echoes of despair and ambition that join with Bjorn's mind, offering him twisted glimpses of power and control, twisting his sense of justice into something cold and punitive. The progression of Bjorn's dilemma is not limited to his psyche. It is reflected in the landscape around him. The Bone Fortress itself, once a symbol of his resilience and connection to the past, begins to feel colder, more oppressive. The shadows dancing on its walls are no longer mere plays of light and dark, but seem to have a life of their own, a reflection of what is consuming Bjorn's soul. The ravens, once seen as messengers of the gods, now seem like sinister observers, their cause interpreted by the Crown as omens of impending doom for those who dare oppose their will. The land he swore to protect, with its fjords and mountains, may begin to feel less like home and more like a battlefield to be conquered, a territory to be subjugated by the brute force the Crown grants him. The duality between guardian and would-be tyrant intensifies. Bjorn may find himself justifying acts of extreme cruelty with arguments he would previously have found abhorrent, seeing them as necessary for the survival of his people, a concept the Crown redefines with every passing moment. So what happens to honor and courage? Courage, in the raw sense, may increase with the power of the Crown, but honor fades. Viking honor, rooted in loyalty, respect, and the pursuit of glorious deeds that echo through the ages, is gradually replaced by a ruthless quest for power and control. Bjorn's courage becomes the audacity of a tyrant, the boldness of one who fears no consequences because he believes himself above them, or because the crown convinces him that such consequences are irrelevant to the order he imposes. Now, consider this. How can a leader who feels the pressure of an existential threat but is bombarded by suggestions of absolute power balance the need for immediate action with the moral principles that define him? Bjorn finds himself driven to act with unprecedented ferocity, but each act of vigilance with the crown alienates him further from himself. He becomes a distorted reflection of his ideals, a miser of his own humanity. Finally, consider how this corruption manifests itself in relationships. The loyalty of his warriors, once unquestionable, may begin to be tested. Do they see the changes in their leader? Do they sense the coldness emanating from him? The crown may whisper to Bjorn to distrust everyone, to eliminate anyone who shows the slightest hesitation or dissent, labeling them traitors. This paranoia, instigated by the crown, isolates Bjorn even further, transforming his fortress of bones into a prison of his own mind, where he reigns supreme but alone, on a throne of fear and despair. The very destiny he was meant to protect begins to be threatened by his own hands, in a cycle of self-destruction that the crown delights in orchestrating. The veil over Bjorn's perception is not a mere blurring, but an active rewriting of reality. The crown of the dead operates like a corrupted oracle, offering not the truth, but its own version of it, tinged with the malice of imprisoned souls. Now notice how this manifests itself. When an ambassador from a neighboring kingdom arrives with proposals for an alliance, Bjorn, under the crown's influence, sees no opportunity for mutual strengthening. Instead, the insidious whispers induce him to interpret every word as a hint of betrayal, every gesture as a prelude to attack. He begins to decode the intentions of others through the prism of fear and distrust the crown instills. The need to ensure safety translates in his distorted mind into the preemptive elimination of any potential threat, even if that threat is a mirage. The ambassador's words, laced with terms of peace and cooperation, are twisted into a veiled power play, and Bjorn's decision to imprison or expel him is no longer a choice governed by prudence, but an imperative dictated by the shadowy entity in his possession. Furthermore, the crown manipulates the very notion of destiny. If Bjorn once felt the weight of a burden imposed by the gods or karma, he is now led to believe that he is the undisputed architect of destiny, shaped by the crown's unchecked will. This illusion of absolute control frees him from any sense of ethical or moral responsibility. The bravery that characterized him in battle, once a reflection of his personal courage and the desire to protect his own, transforms into a reckless, almost suicidal audacity as he believes himself invulnerable. He launches himself into conflicts with heightened ferocity, no longer seeking honorable victory, but total annihilation, a manifestation of the crown's will to eradicate any dissent, any trace of opposition to its emerging power. The strength he demonstrates in combat no longer emanates from his own resilience, but from the energy stolen from the souls the crown forces him to subjugate and consume. Another crucial layer to understand is how the crown affects his self-perception. Bjorn begins to internalize the voices of imprisoned souls, not as echoes of suffering, but as wise counselors, bearers of an ancient and powerful truth. What were once roars of pain and despair become murmurs of wisdom and power, distorting his self-perception from guardian to that of a divinely chosen sovereign to impose order. This inflated self-image blinds him to his own failings and the growing cruelty of his actions. He comes to see himself as the only force capable of keeping chaos at bay, a dark messiah in a world that, according to the crown, can only be saved through total subjugation. In contrast to his previous resilience, Bjorn now strives for brutal efficiency. The loyalty of his warriors, once a source of strength and inspiration, becomes a mere resource to be exploited. If a warrior shows hesitation in the face of a particularly cruel order, the crown sees not a man in conflict, but a weak link, a potential threat to its hegemony. Instead of seeking to understand the source of this hesitation, Bjorn is led to view it as a flaw that must be rooted out, a poison that could contaminate the rest of his forces. The compassion that once defined him as a leader is now seen as a sentimental weakness, an obstacle to the ruthless efficiency the crown demands. He makes decisions that would have been previously unthinkable, such as sacrificing a group of soldiers to create a strategic distraction, or imposing draconian laws that crush the spirit of his people in the name of an order the crown describes as the only salvation. Bjorn's sensory perception, once sharpened by the wilderness and the need for survival, is now haunted by anomalous auditory and visual phenomena. The voices of the Crown of the Dead are no longer mere internal whispers. They have taken on a new dimension, materializing as ghostly echoes that resonate in the deepest chambers of Jotunheim, even when he is alone. These sounds are not just random noises, but fragments of distorted conversations, fragments of laments that insidiously are presented as strategic advice, as ancient wisdom for dealing with external threats. The howling of the wind, which once carried with it clear omens of the gods or elemental forces, now blends with these ethereal sounds, making it impossible to discern what is natural and what is the crown's interference. Parallel to this cacophony, subtle visual manifestations begin to torment Bjorn. He notices fleeting shadows in the corners of his vision, figures that dissipate when he tries to focus on them. These apparitions are not simple optical illusions. They take the forms of ancient, defeated enemies, or warriors who have fallen under his command, their empty eyes fixed on him with silent accusation. The crown, interpreting these visions as warnings against complacency or as manifestations of the enmity surrounding him, uses them to justify even greater acts of cruelty. Now notice how this applies when you, in a position of leadership, face a dilemma where the need for immediate action clashes with the values you hold dear. The crown distorts these visual projections into evidence of impending betrayal, fueling paranoia and justifying drastic measures that would otherwise be considered inhumane. He might, for example, order the execution of a sentry for a momentary lapse of attention, believing that the shadow he saw on his face was the harbinger of a catastrophic failure, a failure the crown had instructed him to prevent at all costs. An additional layer of manipulation lies in the way the crown affects his perception of time. Time, once a linear stream marked by the alternation of day and night, the succession of seasons, and the cycle of life, begins to fragment for Bjorn. Crucial moments in battle can stretch indefinitely in his mind, while periods of calm and reflection can seem to have passed in an instant. This temporal distortion is employed by the crown to intensify the sense of urgency and to obscure the extent of the corruption infiltrating his soul. He feels constantly rushed, as if the end of the world were just around the corner. and this constant anxiety prevents him from questioning the origin and veracity of the advice the crown offers him. The need to act quickly, driven by this distorted perception of time, prevents him from considering the ethical consequences of his decisions, transforming prudence into a forgotten relic of his past. The crown thrives in this temporal chaos, for haste is the enemy of reflection and morality. Consequently, what was once a pause to contemplate the weight of a decision becomes a blind rush to action, with increasingly devastating results. The Crown of the Dead's influence doesn't simply shape Bjorn's perception of external threats or distort his sense of time. It attacks the very core of his interpersonal relationships, dismantling the web of trust that sustained his people. Now consider how this applies when you find yourself in a leadership position, needing to make difficult decisions that affect your followers. The Crown, acting as a social parasite, encourages Bjorn to interpret loyalty as blind subservience. A warrior's hesitation to carry out a brutal order is no longer seen as a sign of moral conflict or concern for the group's well-being, but as an intrinsic flaw in loyalty, a harbinger of insubordination. This distorted interpretation, fueled by the fragments of selfishness and ambition of the souls trapped in the crown, leads Bjorn to progressively isolate himself from his most trusted advisors and his most loyal warriors. He begins to view the need for support and collaboration as a weakness, an unnecessary risk that could compromise his absolute control. Instead of seeking to understand his men's legitimate concerns, he dismisses them as sentimentality or insubordination, intensifying the atmosphere of fear and distrust the crown seeks to impose. Brutal efficiency, which he once saw as a necessary means of survival, now becomes an end in itself, devoid of any human consideration. Furthermore, the Crown of the Dead is not content to merely influence Bjorn's actions. It begins to redefine the very concept of honor and duty within the Viking context. Honor, once intrinsically linked to bravery in battle, loyalty to comrades, and respect for gods and ancestors, is gradually replaced by unquestioning obedience to the will of the crown and the vision of order it imposes. A leader's duty, which once involved protecting his people and ensuring their prosperity, transmutes into an obligation to enforce the crown's will, even if it means oppressing and subjugating those he is supposed to serve. This ideological subversion is particularly insidious because the crown does not explicitly force Bjorn to act against its principles. Instead, it gradually rewrites the definition of those principles, causing acts previously considered cruel or dishonorable to be seen as virtuous, as necessary to maintain a power that is now presented as the only path to salvation. This subtle recontextualization is what allows Bjorn to continue believing in himself as a guardian, even as his actions become increasingly tyrannical. An even deeper layer of the crown's influence lies in its ability to manipulate Bjorn's memory and historical perception. The souls trapped within his diadem, fragments of past lives with their ambitions and resentments, are not merely passive presences. They actively rewrite Bjorn's memories. Events in which he acted with compassion or hesitation are subtly altered in his mind, portrayed as moments of weakness or indecision that nearly led to disaster. In contrast, acts of cruelty or morally questionable decisions are magnified, presented as moments of visionary clarity and unwavering strength. This constant rewriting of the past serves to reinforce the narrative the crown wishes to impose, that Bjorn was always destined to wield this absolute power, and that his methods, however brutal they may seem, are the logical and inevitable continuation of his destiny. This mnemonic manipulation prevents him from recognizing how far he has strayed from his original ideals, creating an illusion of consistency and purpose in his descent into tyranny. Furthermore, the crown exploits the vulnerability inherent in the solitude of power. Bjorn, as guardian, carries a lonely burden. The crown capitalizes on this loneliness, amplifying the sense of isolation and self-sufficiency. The crown's whispers become the only reliable companion, and genuine human interaction is actively discouraged. The crown presents any dependence on outside advice or emotional support as a danger, a vulnerability that Bjorn's enemies could exploit. Thus, the Bone Fortress, which should be a center of power and unity, becomes a symbol of Bjorn's isolation, a sanctuary of his own mind, where the crown reigns supreme, feeding on his growing separation from the real world and his humanity. This erosion of interpersonal connections is a crucial step toward the crown's complete domination of Bjorn's soul. The Crown of the Dead's influence extends beyond psychological manipulation and reality distortion. It operates as an alchemical catalyst for the disintegration of social bonds, transmuting camaraderie into distrust and loyalty into suspicious vigilance. Now, consider how this dynamic manifests when you, in a leadership position, must navigate turbulent waters of uncertainty and potential betrayal. The crown, in its subtle malevolence, not only incites Bjorn to doubt his companions, but actively sows discord. It exploits small frictions, misunderstandings, and latent rivalries among the warriors, amplifying them until they become insurmountable rifts. A clan chief's advice, once listened to with respect, is now met with paranoid scrutiny, where every word is analyzed for ulterior motives, and every suggestion is seen as a veiled attempt to undermine Bjorn's authority or usurp his power. Consequently, the cohesion that once defined the Viking people, forged through joint raids and mutual respect, begins to erode from within. Council meetings, once forums for debate and collaborative decision-making, become stages for veiled accusations and displays of power, where loyalty is expressed not through agreement, but through silent subservience and fear of reprisal. Furthermore, the Crown of the Dead operates as a distorted mirror of his own ambition, reflecting and amplifying Bjorn's darkest desires, but presenting them as imperatives for survival. The yearning for security, which in earlier times might have manifested itself as strengthening defenses and training his warriors, is now corrupted into a compulsion for total control. Now imagine this situation. You are faced with a dilemma where the safety of a small group conflicts with a greater goal that would benefit many. The Crown, in its cold logic, eliminates nuance, reducing the decision to an equation where individual protection becomes an unacceptable luxury. It whispers to Bjorn that true strength lies in suppressing any element that might be perceived as weakness, including compassion for those who do not directly contribute to centralized power. Thus, orders that would previously have been considered excessive, such as the exile of families who failed to demonstrate unwavering fervor, or the confiscation of resources in the name of collective defense, become justified acts of pragmatism. This redefinition of the leader's duty, from protector to absolute controller, is one of the Crown's most devastating legacies. An additional crucial layer lies in the way the Crown attacks the ancestral memory and cultural legacy of the Viking people. The legends of the gods, the tales of ancient heroes, and the traditions that shaped identity from one generation to the next are reinterpreted or neglected. Now consider how this would apply if you were trying to inspire your followers with stories of the past to face present challenges. The Crown, with its own agenda of power, begins to present a narrative where only brute force and blind obedience to the current power holder are the paths forward. The heroic deeds of the past, which once inspired courage and a sense of purpose, are gradually forgotten or distorted into mere examples of primitive conflicts that have been overcome by the new order imposed by the Crown. Respect for ancestors, a pillar of Viking culture, is replaced by a cold and pragmatic devotion to current power, stripping the people of their roots and their collective identity, making them more susceptible to manipulation. This disconnection from the past creates a cultural vacuum, a space the Crown can fill with its own dark dogmas, ensuring that future generations know only the history it wishes to perpetuate. Reflecting on this journey thus far, we perceive an intricate fabric of power, ambition, and the fragility of the human soul. The primordial forces that shaped Bjorn's saga and his legacy are not merely distant echoes of a mythological past. They resonate with startling intensity at the core of present experience. The fine line between defense and domination, once a pillar of a leader's honor, now reveals itself in a spectrum of dark possibilities where pure intention can be subverted by the seductions of absolute power. The elements we have examined converge on a crucial point: the inevitability of confrontation, not only against external threats, but against the very inner abysses that each being carries. The essence of this confrontation lies not in brute force, but in the complex interplay between sealed destiny and the innate ability to forge one's own path, even in the face of seemingly uncontrollable forces. As we observe how promises of order and security can metamorphose into insidious temptations, we understand that ancient wisdom resides not only in tales of bravery, but also in silent warnings about the price of tyranny. The burden of a guardian, when coupled with a power that feeds on the very essence of life, becomes a test of the soul's endurance, where with each seemingly pragmatic choice, a fragment of humanity dissipates. The seeds of distrust, planted in the fertile ground of the solitude of power, germinate in a tangle of isolation, where truth becomes a rare luxury and paranoia a constant companion. At this narrative crossroads, where the timeline seems to bend under the weight of choices, and reality becomes a distorted mirror of one's darkest ambitions, the nature of true heroism is put to the test. It's no longer just about wielding a weapon against an external enemy, but about fighting internal erosion against the seduction of the shortcut that promises peace at the cost of one's own identity. The legacy one seeks to preserve can paradoxically become the instrument of its own destruction if vigilance over the soul is neglected. The complexities intertwined here prepare us for a deeper understanding of what it means to defend not just a kingdom, but the very essence of what makes us human. The echo of the saga of Bjorn the Guardian resonates not only in the icy landscapes of a distant past, but in the very depths of human existence. The throne of bones and the crown of the dead, more than artifacts of power, have become a relentless mirror of the temptation inherent in anyone caught between protection and oppression. The fine line Bjorn struggled to maintain between the honor that defined him and the dark seduction of absolute control proves to be a timeless allegory, a leader's journey. The inevitable dance between destiny and free will is here distilled in its purest and most poignant form. Constant vigilance over one's own soul is the true fortress, more indestructible than any wall of ancient bones. We now understand that power, at its core, is not intrinsically good or evil. It is the heart that wields it, and the intention that guides it that determine its legacy. The crown, by eroding compassion and distorting perception, not only robbed Bjorn of his humanity, but showed us the path to our own downfall. The belief that security can be bought by surrendering freedom, that order can be imposed by suppressing truth. What seemed like a shield to protect, in corrupt hands, becomes the weapon that dismantles the fabric of trust and community, reducing bravery to a mere reflection of cruelty. The lesson to be drawn is not a mere summary of the battles fought in Jotunheim, but a call to profound introspection. For the shadows Bjorn faced in his icy fortress, the voices that tempted him to tyranny, do not reside only in ancient artifacts. They inhabit the recesses of every heart, waiting for the slightest weakness, the smallest chink in the armor of our own integrity. True practice, the awakening to wisdom that transcends ages, lies not in wielding legendary axes or reigning upon macabre thrones, but in cultivating, day after day, the courage to look within, to discern truth from illusion, and to persistently choose the path of light, even when darkness promises a swifter and seemingly safer end. May Bjorn's saga be for us not a cautionary tale of the past, but a beacon for the future.